Remote ID is here. And if you fly a remote-controlled aircraft in the United States, it affects you. If you don't know what Remote ID is and why RC pilots are freaking out about it, I'm going to tell you that in this video. But I'm also going to give you some concrete things we can do to protect ourselves from the negative effects of Remote ID. And I'm going to close out with a little bit of a message of hope that maybe things aren't as bad as they seem. I don't want to just assume that everybody watching this video already knows all the details of Remote ID. So we're going to start with a chapter about what is Remote ID. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. And if you already think you know, there are chapter markers and timestamps down in the timeline and in the video description. But I would encourage you to take a few minutes to watch this, because I think there's a lot of people out there who think they know what Remote ID is, but maybe have some misconceptions or misunderstandings. It's your call. Remote ID is a requirement imposed by the FAA that RC aircraft in flight in the national airspace of the United States broadcast certain information while they are flying. The three key pieces of information that they broadcast include the location, basically the GPS coordinates of the aircraft, the GPS coordinates of the pilot, and a unique identifier. The unique identifier is an ID number that is assigned to the pilot when they register the aircraft. It is broadcast during flight, and then theoretically, like law enforcement could take that identifier, go back to the FAA and say, tell me the identity of the person who was registered to this drone that was flying in this area at this time. Remote ID applies to all small unmanned aerial systems is the term the FAA uses, SUAS. It applies to all RC aircraft in the national airspace, whether they are fixed wing or multi-rotor, whether they have an FPV camera system or not, and whether they have a GPS or not. One of the only sort of blanket exemptions is that aircraft under 250 grams are exempt as long as they are flown for recreational purposes. But when they are flown for commercial purposes, in other words, Part 107, then they are not exempt anymore. The other major exemption to Remote ID is that the FAA defined the concept of a FRIA, F-R-I-A, an FAA-recognized identification area, I think is what it stands for. And basically, a FRIA is like your local AMA field goes to the FAA, applies to be a FRIA, they get approved to be a FRIA, and then aircraft that are flown at that location do not need to have a Remote ID broadcast. That's great if you fly at an AMA field, but the FAA has rejected applications for essentially every other location that isn't an AMA field, and even some AMA fields have been rejected. At the time that I'm making this, no FRIAs have actually finished their approval process, so it still remains to be seen how that will pan out. There are two types of Remote ID. The first is standard Remote ID, and it is required to be included in every fully assembled, essentially ready to fly RC aircraft that's sold in the United States. The manufacturer is required to include it. So if you buy a DJI drone like a DJI Avata, it's going to have Remote ID already built in, enabled, and working. There's nothing you need to do to make that happen. In fact, there's also nothing you can do to sort of avoid that happening. Sellers of bind and fly, ready to fly RC hobby aircraft are in a weird situation, since they are essentially unable to meet the requirements of Remote ID from a sort of technical and business and economic perspective, but they are expected to include it, and it remains to be seen how they will get around that. The other type of Remote ID is what's known as module-based Remote ID. And the idea here is that if you are a hobbyist who builds your own RC aircraft, you shouldn't be have the same requirements imposed on you as a manufacturer of RC aircraft. So what you'll do is you'll take your existing aircraft or new aircraft that you build, and you will install a Remote ID module on the aircraft, and that module will be responsible for broadcasting the information that is required to be broadcast. So what's the big deal? Why are people freaking out about this? Because some people might say, hey, I buy my DJI Avata, it's got this Remote ID requirement, I'm broadcasting this information, okay, fine, but fundamentally, my experience of using the drone is the same as it always has been. I just take it out and I fly it and I do what I'm gonna do. And some people who build self-build drones will say, okay, I guess I gotta put this module on here. It's one more piece of equipment I gotta add, but at the end of the day, I can still fly and I can still do what I wanna do. And if you feel that way, I'm not gonna try to talk you out of that, because for some people, that will be the experience that they have. Some people are fine with just fitting within that box and getting on with their life. But a lot of people aren't. And some of the people who think that's a fine box to fit in haven't really thought it through and realized all the potential downsides of this system. So we don't even have time to go into all of them, but let's talk about some of the major ones. Number one, cost. Remote ID modules are not cheap. The cheapest ones that we've seen so far run in the like $60 or $70 range. Some of them go into the $200 or $300 range. Hobbyists are allowed to move the module between their aircraft, so they might need to buy just one and go through the hassle of unplugging it and plugging it in again each time they switch from one aircraft to another. Commercial 107 operators are expected to have a unique module for every single one of their aircraft. Number two, safety and security. It's no surprise that some people are not happy when people fly RC aircraft in public, even if those people are flying in a perfectly safe and responsible manner. The ability to simply pull out a smartphone app and look up the location of the pilot that is flying that drone over there and see that pilot's GPS coordinates will compromise the security of some pilots in some circumstances. It is going to be easier to find those pilots, easier to approach them, and then easier to potentially threaten or attack them. Number three, privacy. Americans famously don't like the government getting up in their business. They don't like the government tracking where they are and what they do, and Remote ID will enable the government to do that. Although the information being broadcast by Remote ID is not sent to a central location for collection, as of today, it is still possible to just set up a device that records every drone that flies within range of it and just record that information forever. So that the police, for example, could go look and say, hey, on what dates did this FAA number fly in this location? And then go back to the FAA and say, who is this person? That just makes a lot of people really, really uneasy. Number four, this isn't the end. If this was as bad as it was going to get, maybe some people would say, okay, I can accept this. But this is just phase one of the FAA's plan, and we know that because the FAA Reauthorization Act is currently going through Congress, and we can see the things related to Remote ID that are currently in that, and we can see that they are not stopping here, but they are going further. So what can we do about it? And I want to start this section of the video with a discussion of kind of where we are right now, because you're going to fight very differently if it's like the first inning of the baseball game and the score is 0-0 than if it's like the ninth inning and you're down by 3 runs. Right? You're going to play very differently in those situations. It doesn't make sense to try to do things that would have been effective back in 2020 when the rule was first proposed. There was an open request for comments section where the FAA invited the public to comment. This is something that's actually required to be done before any new federal rule is made. We did that. We sent in over 50,000 comments, and they were, well, in my opinion, they were largely ignored or willfully misinterpreted, but we did that. The time for letter writing to the FAA is over. They're not listening to our letters, they're just going straight in the trash. The time for speaking to our congressional representatives, more power to you if you actually know a congressional representative and can actually get them to listen to you, but there has been several attempts at letter writing to try to get changes made in the laws, because after all, the FAA has to do what Congress tells them to do or tells them not to do. And that has not been effective so far, and at this point, it's hard to believe that it will be effective. So letter writing campaigns to Congress, to me at least, feels like the time for that. That's been demonstrated not to work, and the time is past. What about working within the system? Groups like the FPV Freedom Coalition and the Flight Test Community Association have worked with the FAA to try to make gains and try and educate them that hobbyists exist and what we want from this regulation. And there are some cases you can point to where instead of things being very, 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 very bad, they were only very, 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 very bad. And they should get credit for that, but I don't think they're gonna save us from this. I hope that they continue working, and I hope that we fully continue to support them, if only because them being in the room as the decisions are made gives useful intel about how the process is going and just how badly we're screwed. But I don't think they're going to save us and roll this all back. I should say that, in my opinion, the AMA has been completely disinterested in helping FPV hobbyists in general and has only been interested in saving their flight fields and the people who fly at them. If you are an AMA member, then by all means, you're getting some benefit from your support of the AMA. But if you do not fly at an AMA field, they are not only not helping you, but they are actively trying to throw groups like FPV Freedom Coalition and FTCA under the bus and hope that by doing that, they'll be able to escape. That's my personal opinion. So I don't think that there's any reason for FPV hobbyists to support the AMA. And in fact, I've let my membership lapse and will not be renewing it. What about public awareness campaigns? There have been a ton of them so far. Video campaigns like this one, trying to get word out about RemoteID. And the thing is that the tone of those campaigns needs to change and is changing. And what I mean by that is that instead of saying RemoteID is scary and we need to mobilize to fight it and try to change it, now it feels like it is here. We see that our ability to affect real change in it is extremely limited, and the message of the public awareness campaign needs to be different. Because here's the thing, when people hear about RemoteID, they get scared and they say this is bullshit and I'm just not going to enjoy this hobby. And that is the biggest threat of RemoteID to this hobby, is people dropping out because they think it's scarier than it really is. And that brings us to our message of hope. And the message of hope is that for the vast majority of FPV and RC hobbyists, none of this matters. None of this matters. If you just pretend this doesn't exist and go fly your drones, just like you always have, nothing will happen to you, almost certainly. Like theoretically, could an FAA inspector walk up behind you while you're flying, tap you on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, sir, did you have a RemoteID module on that?" Yeah, and if that happens, then you're potentially going to get a fine from the FAA. But what are the chances of that happening? They don't have enough people to enforce it to matter to the vast majority of people. And even attempts by the FAA to rope in local law enforcement. Local law enforcement cannot enforce federal regulations, but what they can do is they can say, hey, federal regulators, I saw this guy, he was here, he was doing this thing, and it was in violation, and they can sort of give evidence, and then the FAA can come ding you. Despite that, local law enforcement is also super overworked and probably doesn't give a crap. So, unless you are behaving in such a way as to make a local cop want to come hassle you, if you are a high visibility person who's, if you violate the rules, you will immediately come to the FAA's attention. If you're just a typical person who flies in your backyard, or maybe even flies in a park somewhere where no people are around, you probably will never even know this exists. In my opinion, the only people for whom RemoteID really matters today, right now, are people who make a living flying RC aircraft. Because we cannot fly under the radar, and even if you are not necessarily publicly visible, when you show up to a job, your employer, your customer is going to say, hey, you got your 107, right? They're going to want to know that you're ticking all the boxes. And if you're violating some regulation as part of your business, then theoretically you're going to have liability. Maybe your insurance isn't going to pay out if there's an incident. Maybe you're not going to get hired. And if you get caught violating the rules, then potentially you're going to get your Part 107 pulled, and many customers won't even hire you. And that leads us to the next part of this video, which is, it's okay to comply with RemoteID if you decide that's what you want to do or need to do as a person. I like to make an analogy to cannabis legalization. I've lived through a period where cannabis was completely illegal everywhere in the United States, and I've seen it change to being more legal as time has gone on. And in the times when it was illegal, there were people who said, I'm going to fight this by not complying. I refuse to comply. I'm going to use cannabis. And there were people who said, look, I get drug tested at my job. I can't afford to lose my job. I'm not going to smoke. And both of those people are doing what they need to do to survive and make it in their own circumstance. The single biggest mistake we can make is to divide ourselves as hobbyists And one of the ways that we do that is to say, if you're not doing exactly what I think you need to be doing, you're wrong and screw you. I've heard people say that if you comply with remote ID, you're part of the problem. I think that's a mistake. I don't think we should do that. Those people are also our allies. They also think remote ID is bullshit and want to fight it. They just don't feel that they can take the risk of publicly not complying. I've also heard people say that not complying itself is resistance. And I want to take a second to address that, because I'm not sure that's true. Non-compliance with a law or rule that you think is wrong or unjust is obviously a very, very important way of fighting it. But non-compliance by itself is not sufficient to change the rule. For example, if you think that speed limits are immoral, and so you drive 20 miles over the speed limit everywhere you go, that is not going to result in speed limits being raised. It's just going to result in you getting tickets. If you look at effective means of civil change through non-compliance, what they have in common is that they show the injustice of the rule or the law by taking victims of the rule and making the injustice visible. So if we think about the civil rights movement in the United States, there were people having truncheons and fire hoses and dogs put on them, and there was video footage of that put on the news, and enough people saw that and went, hey, this is wrong, that that had an effect. But it's also important to point out that that was not the only way that they were fighting. You have Rosa Parks sit on a bus, she gets arrested, and now there is this legal challenge that was all set up and ready to go. So if you don't comply, good, more power to you. But please be aware that that non-compliance by itself is not effective activism that will result in a change in the rules. That if you want to change the rules and if you believe that they can be changed, you have to do more than simply say, I won't comply. The final thing I want to show you in this video is something you can do to protect yourself from the downside of remote ID and a form of civil disobedience that spoils remote ID for the state actors who want to benefit from it. You see, someone has created a little device that broadcasts a bunch of fake remote ID information so that if you are flying, maybe with or without a remote ID module on your drone, then there's this just huge cloud of fake invisible drones flying around that anybody looking at their smartphone app and going, hey, who's that flying, will have to trouble figuring out which one's you, or maybe none of them are you because you don't have remote ID on your drone. And the most interesting thing about this is that as far as I can tell, there's nothing illegal about it. At no point did they make a rule that said you're not allowed to broadcast fake remote ID information. Maybe they will. If you want to learn more about how to make this, I've got a video showing how to do it. It's linked down in the video description, and there's a card on screen showing you how to do it. I'll see you there.